begin today's conversation by acknowledging the Ohlone and Coast Miwok people who inhabited Bay Area lands for 10,000 years. I'm Greg Dalton. In 2007, I went to the Arctic on a global warming expedition with scientists and journalists aboard an icebreaker. Experiencing climate change at the top of the world changed my life, and when I returned, I created Climate One as a project here at the Commonwealth Club. For the last 13 years, I've been interviewing leaders about how burning fossil fuels disrupts all of the systems around us. Our food system, our water systems, our ecosystems, our lifestyle, and our economy. Climate changes everything. Today, we're peering out over the climate cliff. How long do we have before we pass the point of no return and really bad, irreversible things start happening? Scientists say dramatic reductions in carbon emissions need to be made by 2030. That's 10 years from now. Chris Field is director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. He's among the senior leadership of the IPCC, and in 2015, he was one of 5 candidates in the election to be chair of the IPCC. Renee Lertzman is climate engagement strategist, author, speaker, and psychologist. David Fenton is founder of Fenton Communications and a veteran of many campaigns for social change. He's collaborated with Al Gore, Nelson Mandela, and other leaders. Please give them a warm and hearty welcome to the Climate One stage. Welcome to you all. Chris Field, let's begin with you. We've been hearing this 2030 deadline. We got 10 years before. What's going to happen? Tell us the science and what's going to happen in 2030.
Greg, probably the most important change in our understanding of the forcing and responses to climate change is the recognition that there's basically a forever CO2 budget. And the forever CO2 budget to have a 2/3 probability of staying under 1.5 C is around 2,750 billion tons. Really big number. But we've already emitted over 2,200 billion tons, and we're emitting about 40 billion a year. If you do the math, what that means is that if we want to have a 2/3 probability of stabilizing warming at less than 1.5 C, we've got order 10 years of emissions at current rates as the remaining lifetime forever budget. Now you can say, well, we can just slow down and we can go way past 2030, but we're not slowing down. We've been speeding up in recent years. And this recognition that that's the budget, no matter what we do, is really changed the conversation, and it's what brings us here this afternoon.
And it's mind-blowing to think that, I keep coming back to this, that half of that forever budget has happened in the last, 30 years? Since
Less time than that.
Right? Since Jim Hansen testified before Congress, since Al Gore's first film. So most of that's been burned in the last 30 years. So tell us, Chris Field, there's a lot of debate between a 1.5 degrees warming world and a 2-degree world. You think that distinction is too sharply chiseled. Why?
There are a whole bunch of reasons that we need to stop climate change. But there are a lot of reasons that it's hard. And a lot of the reasons it's hard is that fossil fuels have fueled the legitimate development aspirations of people around the world, especially people in poor countries where the alternatives for access to energy, for transportation, aren't anywhere near as mature as they are here. And so I think we need to be open-minded about our need for energy as the source for development aspirations, for meeting development aspirations around the world. What I think we need to do about climate change is work as hard as possible to be on a trajectory of ambitious mitigation. If we do that, the IPCC has shown that it's technically feasible to stabilize warming at 1.5, but it's also shown that it's really hard. A world of ambitious mitigation might end us up at somewhere between 1.5 and 2, or it might end us up a little bit warmer than 2, but all those are worlds where the risks of really serious tipping points, the risks of catastrophic interactions among different kinds of impacts, and the risk of the kind of social collapse that makes it really hard to govern the not only the climate system, but the global system, are really manageable. It's important to distinguish this world of ambitious mitigation from the world of continued high emissions that we're on now. That's the important distinction. Whether it's 1.5, 1.7, or 2 is much less important.
So some people get a little too hung up on the right side of the decimal point of the degree. David Fenton, this deadline has made its way into the political campaign, headlines. A lot of people say, we got 10 years. Do you worry about deadline panic?
Well, panic shuts people down, but I don't think it's a binary choice between hope and panic. I think it's a question of how you combine the two in talking to people, because we can't solve this. We know how to solve it, but if we don't solve it, we're in a lot of trouble. So I think you have to tell people both things. It's not enough to tell people that we can solve it, because then there's no urgency, and it is an urgent situation. And on the other hand, if you only tell people it's catastrophic, a lot of people are going to go to the beach. So it's like most things, it's how you balance the messages.
Renee Lertzman?
Can I just ask, Chris, where did the cut 50% in 10 years come from? Was that in the IPCC?
There are lots of trajectories you can think about for getting from high emissions to zero emissions. One way to do it is take the amount we've got and slice a diagonal through it and flip the upper triangle down. That gets you to a 50% cut in 10 years. It's really, really hard to go from our current emissions, which has a CO2 equivalent of about 50 billion tons a year, to nothing in 20 years. And so to the extent that we use more negative emissions in the future, we can have more continuing emissions in the near term, but it's really wiggling the details. If we're gonna cut to zero, we basically have to come really close to having emissions every 10 years.
Right.
Renee Lertzman, I'd like to hear your thought on these targets. As a psychologist, someone thinks about how humans process these things. Mm-hmm. Your thought about these particular targets, which are prevalent now in our popular culture and media culture. What's your take on these targets?
Well, I'm primarily interested in how we process information that's charged and emotional, and hearing you speak about the data, it's incredibly triggering charged emotional content. So that's the lens that I'm bringing through this. So naturally, when we're confronted with information that's threatening, that's scary, that's overwhelming, we want to hold on to something tangible, and we want to, it's also a very powerful tool to mobilize and spark action. So a lot of companies, organizations use targets, cities, governments, to say, this is what we're going to do. My concern, so it's a yes
walk
and.
With how many steps am I going to take today, right?
Right, so. Exactly. But it's a yes and with regards to targets and climate change, because the risk is that we set ourselves up with an oversimplification, for one, of what it really is involved to get to these targets. We leave ourselves vulnerable potentially to missing the messy, complicated, nuanced roadmap to get to the targets, right? So I understand the need for a target to kind of spark that, get you motivated kind of thing, but ultimately I don't see it as a viable framework unless it comes with a deep, thoughtful roadmap that we are co-creating together.
There's also a bit of fatigue. David Fenton, I'm pretty sure I heard Al Gore 15 years ago say we got 10 years, and here we are. So...
Well, I'm not responsible for what Al Gore says or doesn't say.
Well, you did advise him, but yes.
But, we have to thank the vice president for sounding the alarm about this.
Sure.
He was right. I think there's a bigger problem than this, which is most people still don't know a lot about this. Most people still don't think this is urgent. Only 30% of Americans think solving climate change is an urgent problem. And, even here in California, where people know more about this than other places because of the fires, et cetera, only 50% of Californians think this will affect them in their lifetime. So I think that we have not done a good enough job of raising public knowledge, understanding, and urgency on this issue, and I think that's the bigger problem.
Oh,
Can
can
I
I
say
say
one-
something?
Go ahead, Renee. But
Well,
Right.
again, through the lens of how we process charged, complicated content data, there's such a thing as willful ignorance. There's the fact that we often go into an inability cognitively to process information that we don't want, that's distressing, that challenges our worldview and identity. So when we hear data about people don't know or people aren't engaged, I always think of it in the context of what are people maybe distancing or avoiding or kind of in some form of soft or hard denial around, as opposed to taking it at face value that people, I don't buy that people are as ignorant as we think they are. There's a willful ignorance because it's too overwhelming, it's too scary to contemplate. And for a lot of people I talk to, they don't even know how to go there. They need some guidance along the way.
And there's some people who don't like the solutions to climate change, therefore they're not going to acknowledge the problem. Chris Field.
I just wanted to say one thing in defense of Al Gore. 15 years ago, it made sense to say we have not yet seen impacts from climate change, but we will in a few years, and we have. Now we have definitely passed the threshold where year after year after year, we're seeing real impacts of climate change that in some cases are really having devastating consequences.
Big change. So as David says, the weather is teaching people it's happening now. It's no longer something far off. Climate writer Abby Rabinowitz surveyed a bunch of writers who cover climate change and asked how the media could do a better job on the beat. Here are insights from her reporting and her experience.
We're actually at a really exciting moment with climate coverage. Elizabeth Colbert, who writes on climate change for The New Yorker, has said that 2019 was the year we discovered climate change, finally. One part of my theory of covering climate change is that we need to realize it's not just a big topic by itself. It's not like covering the Super Bowl. It's not like covering the election. In fact, it's sort of the framework in which all other stories are happening right now. I interviewed a number of editors and also writers for a piece I wrote for the Columbia Journalism Review. And one thing I heard a lot is that climate change should frame every beat, and it should be on every beat as long as it's applicable. It's environmental, it's business, it's social, it's the air we breathe, it's our personal health, it's our allergies, it's Lyme disease. It's all climate change. I don't think the science is actually that complicated or strange. It's a very intuitive concept. We're blanketing the Earth with this gas that contains heat. I wonder how often people think about the science behind gravity. Does it need to be explained every single time we report a sports article? Well, the ball dropped because gravity was happening, and this is about the mass of a greater object and the mass of a smaller object and attraction. You don't need to do it every time. The truth is frightening and clear enough that we can be both accurate and urgent in our language as journalists. I think that we need to tell engaging, rich stories with protagonists. I think we need stories about people working to make a change in the face of extraordinary loss and grief that they're taking personally.
That was journalist Abby Rabinowitz, who also directs the writing program at NYU's Engineering School. David Fenton, a lot in there. Don't need to talk about the science, don't need to talk about gravity. Personal human stories. Your response to what she said.
True and not true. Stories are great. They're important. They inspire people. But there is an information deficit in this country. I'm advising a group right now that just did a survey of coastal property owners in a very vulnerable state who own middle-class homes on the coast. And we asked them if it was flooding more, they said yes. We asked them if they were concerned about the flooding, they said yes. We asked them, what's causing the flooding? 80% said bad sewage systems and overdevelopment. Only 20% could identify rising seas from climate change. And if you trace the actual data and information flow to people like that, mostly people don't read newspapers as much as they used to. They get most of their information online, and those people, most of what they see online is that climate change is a hoax. That's what most conservatives see. So there is an information deficit. And I think also that to arouse the public to mobilize for the transformation of the economy that we need and all of the infrastructure, people have to be able to explain to you why we have to do that. And they're not really at the point where enough people can do that yet.
So, Chris Field, we heard there that science is not that complicated. The science is simple. And David also mentioned information deficit, which is the idea that people just had more information. One more book, one more podcast, one more this. They would somehow a flip would switch in their brain and they get it. But that's flawed, isn't it?
You know,
And I'm not saying that.
David makes a compelling argument, though, and you know, he's the person who has done the surveys to ask whether people have heard the information. In my presentations, you know, I suspect all of you know about climate change and care about it enough to come. And I think that we can potentially fool ourselves into feeling that the messages are spreading more effectively and more broadly. And I think that the counter narrative that climate change is a hoax probably has traction, and it may well have way more traction than I appreciate.
Well, I just want to say it goes back to the point around how do we process charged and difficult information and data. And I've interviewed hundreds of people having in-depth conversations, and what I find is a very complicated picture where people kind of know, but they kind of don't want to know and choose not to know. And so what that suggests to me is that we do need to be incredibly thoughtful about the ways in which we are communicating with people that ideally sort of soften that defensive limbic response, which can include the personal storytelling and the sense that there's some hopefulness and there's some solutions, as well as being able to just be real and honest and acknowledge, like, this is intense, this is hard, you might feel this, you might feel overwhelmed, you might feel that. That can actually allow people to process and learn more effectively about what's happening.
And we often think of the information deficit model as, you're an idiot, I'm right, I'm going to give you the facts. And we know that doesn't work.
Right.
Persuasion doesn't work. When do you, although people try often, if I just persuade you, if you just knew this fact and swallowed it, you'd think you'd see it like I do, and then things would be okay.
But cognitive science shows us what does work. And everything Renee said is completely true. You have to do this in the right way that acknowledges people's feelings and fear and all of that. But the main thing to know is what changes the brain is the repetition of simple messages that mostly have a moral context and are emotional. It is the repetition that changes it. We hate Make America Great Again, but I'm sorry to tell you, the science is clear. That works. Now, in the community of scientists and activists, understandably, complexity is what we value to try to get to the truth, but communicating in a complex way does not work. Only simplicity works, and only repetition works. And a lot of us don't like to simplify things, and we hate repeating ourselves, but that's what works.
Saddam 9/11, Saddam 9/11, Saddam 9/11, Saddam 9/11. That clearly worked. David Fenton, also, why is that? It gets to where people go to school and the way they think in terms of, spin that out a little bit, in terms of the way people think, the repetition, and how that's rewarded or not rewarded in people's careers.
Well, people that go to business school learn cognitive science, and they have to learn how to sell things and market things to advance their careers, to sell products and services. So that's their orientation. And people in the sciences and the law and the humanities, that's not what they study. And so it's kind of a mismatch. So, a lot of us think that kind of because we know something, we assume other people know it too. And the other side does not make that mistake.
Right. Renee Lertzman, you mentioned the limbic system. Let's drill into serotonin and dopamine. Tell us about what those two things are and how they come to play here.
Just a small question about brain science. Well, in the context of this conversation, what I'm most interested in is what triggers our dopamine response and what supports our serotonin, and we can think of that as a metaphor for engagement with the issue. How do we stay connected and engaged with an issue that is scary and overwhelming and so forth? So the research that I found game-changing has been by Robert Lustig here at UCSF, where he wrote a great book, Hacking the American Mind, where he talks about what has been established to promote dopamine and serotonin. And for him, he came up with what he calls the 4 C's. And I use these 4 C's in my climate communications and engagement work. It's when we feel connected, when we feel we are contributing to something, when we feel that we have tools to cope with stressors. And his 4th C is cooking, which is very interesting because apparently cooking makes us, it promotes a lot of serotonin. I tend to kind of interchange cooking with creativity. So when we're creatively involved in the stuff of our lives, gardening, cooking, what have you, and what I relate that to with the climate crisis is when people are asking me, how do we design a way to engage people, make people care, and motivate people? I always flip it in the context of what promotes serotonin. In other words, we're in this for the long haul. This is a marathon, it's not a sprint. There's lots of things that can promote kind of short action, like here's a pledge, and here's a challenge, and here's a target.
So that's dopamine, which is like a quick sugar high.
It's a quick kind of like immediate, more of a limbic response, whereas the serotonin you might think of as what is sustaining, and that's through relationship, and it's through our experience of ourselves as having agency, feeling that we have some power and that we're in control. So when I'm giving advice, I would say, well, as long as you allow people or enable people to feel that we are partners, that you are just as much a part of this story as I am, and that we are in this together, that in itself really allows us to face what I think is on some level unthinkable. I mean, for you, like, Chris, I would say you're on a front line of sorts of really facing the science and the data in a way that many, many people, I think, would find very hard to do emotionally and cognitively. And I think, we all have our strategies for doing what we do, right? But when we feel that we have some sense of connection with it, that allows us to, I found in myself, I can learn more easily. I can actually retain the information that you have to share and to offer.
Chris Field, how do you not get fried and burnt out?
Really great. How?
But when I look at the data, what I see is the potential for solutions and for managing the impacts of the changes that we can't avoid, bringing emissions down to zero in a way that builds a better world. And the frustrations I face aren't with the physics of the atmosphere and the way ecosystems respond. It's that society is so reluctant to embrace the things that really are great opportunities as well as confronting major challenges.
And Chris Field, there's the word extinction gets thrown around a lot these days, and you're not. It's interesting. Some of the climate scientists are often invoked. Scientists say we got to go faster, and yet you talk to individual scientists, and their hair's not on fire. Some of them are more moderate and temperate than the people who are quoting the scientists. So tell us, about is the actual extinction of the human race, is that in the models, or is it, because we often hear this is existential, human extinction, right? Is that really a possibility in the math you look at?
You want a yes or no?
Not yet. That comes
here's
later.
a way to think about it. There's no question that we have seen major extinctions through the history of the Earth. Many people feel that we may be starting into a 6th major extinction. In the most massive extinctions to date, we've seen a loss of as many as 90% of the species from the geological record. We've seen only a few extinctions that we can trace with any level of confidence to climate change so far, but we've only seen a small amount of the climate change we might see. And again, I want to contrast a world of ambitious mitigation where we would see more extinctions, almost certainly not the extinction of humanity, and a world of continued high emissions. And that world of continued high emissions, what really bothers me, well, it bothers me that in 2100 we might be looking at 4.5 to 5 C warming over pre-industrial. But what really bothers me about that is that we're still warming at 0.5 C per decade.
Can you tell people what that is in Fahrenheit?
About 1 Fahrenheit per decade, roughly. And to
But
think
5
about
C
that,
is how much Fahrenheit?
9.
These are Americans.
Yeah, okay. These people know what a centigrade degree is, right? Okay. I apologize if I was.
I'm talking about your
abstruse.
TV audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's really rapid warming into the indefinite future that we worry about, and we often don't think enough about the way that every time we build a new coal-fired power plant, every time somebody builds a new kerosene-powered jetliner, we're committed to decades of using that infrastructure. And what I'm worried about is that if we're still building new power plants and new kerosene-powered jetliners in 2080, we're going to cruise through the end of the century mark with that continued warming. Now, what happens if we're warming at, to defer to David's recommendation that we use English units, when we're more than 10 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial, and when we're increasing at a degree per decade? Is there a risk that humankind would become extinct as a result of this? So we have no way of even making crude estimates. I can tell you that if you look at the evidence from economists, they say some places do better, some places do worse with warming. And even if you project that out to the kind of massive amounts of warming we're talking about. On the other hand, look at the COVID-19, the coronavirus, and the way that the stock market's dropped over 3% today, and out of recognition that this is something that's getting out of hand. And compared to the climate crisis, it's a pretty small thing. And it shows the way that events can snowball. And so personally, I think that we're on a trajectory to solve climate change way before the extinction of the human race is a major risk. But the possibility of interacting impacts, unexpected complications, breakdown of the social fabric, and loss of key ecosystem services point to a much more challenging future unless we stay in this world of ambitious mitigation.
And if I may, I don't know about extinction, but I do know that at the rate we're going, we'll have to abandon all the coastal cities of the world at some point. And imagine the chaos. How do we survive that? People in southern Asia, India, and Pakistan will literally die walking out on the street. We won't be able to till the fields. That is what we're headed for. I believe it's true that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now, previous in Earth's geologic history, that same amount, the seas were about 70 feet higher than they are today. So we're not only going to have to reduce emissions, we're going to have to take some of this stuff out of the air. And the good news is that we can, and we can do it. It's certainly affordable. It's a lot more affordable than all that destruction. But we have to rally the public to demand this. That's the only solution I see.
We're talking about the 2030 climate deadline at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Chris Field, director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University, Renee Lertzman, a climate engagement strategist and author, and David Fenton, a founder of Fenton Communications, which runs advocacy campaigns for social change. Renee Lertzman, this gets
Can I just make one-
Sure, Chris
Yeah,
Field.
I made a
the
mistake.
last time
right.
the CO2 concentration was as high as it is now, we think the sea level was about 6 meters higher.
6 meters.
That's a lot.
Oh,
6
that's
20
meters
feet,
is about
right.
20 feet,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
not 70 feet.
That's enough, right? Okay, thank you.
That'll still flood most major cities. Which Renee Lertzman, this gets to the point of debate: is how candid, how dark is it, how screwed are we, and should we really talk about that? Or some people say, no, don't say that because there's a paralysis or a despair. But you think that's a myth? Why? That people will lapse into despair if they're told the dark truth.
Well, I think that humans in some way or another, we actually respond and crave truth, even if it's hard truth. But the question is what the context is that allows us, those conditions you talked about in your opening, what are the optimal conditions that allow us to really be with what's real and what's true? We see this in young people. Young people light up and crave learning and knowledge and truth. And so I think it's incredibly dangerous to think that we need to ever minimize, to soften, to sugarcoat, to not go there, to keep it all light and solutions oriented, and not talk about the reality of loss and turbulence and despair and disruption. It's like, give it to me. It's a sense of like, give it to me straight. Like, people have a radar for being messed around. I'm thinking about interviews I did a few years ago with Republican climate skeptics and about climate change. And what I was hearing in these conversations that were very conversational was, under the surface, I heard this sense that people felt patronized, and they felt like, oh, we're not hearing, no one's being straight with us, and people think we're dumb, and and it just fueled this profound sense of feeling not part of the conversation, which then makes, I think, slogans like "Make America Great Again" like very compelling and very powerful. So I think we have to be so, like, when we're not real, that's what happens, is that people go into this kind of polarity, this response of kind of, we go to either the black or the white, that kind of reductive thinking.
So you think that people can handle the truth, they won't get stuck in it, they actually crave it, they want it, and
it's the conditions in which that happens. That makes all the difference. If you're in a classroom where you're able to actually talk about what comes up for you as we're learning these things, what are your responses? What does this make you think about? What are you excited about? What are you scared about? If you're in a family, if you're in a group of friends, if you're a program like this, it's the conditions that allow us to confront and be with what is scary and hard. And that's where relationship comes in. When we feel that we're in relationship and connection, we can handle so much more than if we feel like we're alone and we're sort of on our own with it.
One thing I struggle with is like knowing this how dark this is, and trying to. Today was a beautiful day in San Francisco, and it's February, and it should be raining, and it hasn't rained, and this could be a very dry, bad February. So Renee Lertzman here, I'll put you next to me because I need a psychologist help here. How can people enjoy a sunny day and say, this is a beautiful day, and be in the moment, and also know that it is a sign of danger, and that there are bad things happening and will happen that we can't do anything about? A lot we can. How can we enjoy today and be present and yet still know that we are headed toward this cliff?
Well, I think that's precisely the psychological development or evolution that we're being called on right now, which is to be able to hold tension, hold ambiguity, hold paradox, hold contradiction, and stay in that nuanced place where it's a yes and. Yes, we can. We are here right now. This is all we have, is right now in this present moment. And we're alive right now. And we have a lot of abundance and amazing things in our lives to appreciate, especially right here in the Bay Area. It's important that we stay grounded in that we stay rooted to our experience right now. And at the same time, we can still have an anxiety that's like, I'm enjoying this, but this is also kind of freaking me out. And that's what resilience is. If we think about what is resilience, what is a resilient way of engaging with these issues, it's really about being able to stay present and stay engaged with what is and what is coming, and to just be able to hold that and stay functional. Does that make sense?
Sure. David Fenton, a lot of people would say that, a lot of communication people say, we got to be upbeat or optimistic, because otherwise we got to, sell it. Don't talk about sacrifice, because Americans don't do that anymore. Maybe they did during World War II. You got to sugarcoat this whole thing.
Well, that's just morally wrong. People deserve the truth. It's a moral imperative. And people can handle the truth. And we cannot transform every building, every airplane, every car, and every power plant like we have to, unless the public is engaged in understanding that this is an emergency and this is like war. And by the way, war has very interesting psychological effects on populations. More babies are born, people have lots of fun. This is going to be like a war, only it's a good war to save ourselves, and we're going to come out much better for it. Energy is going to be cheaper, that is for sure. We're going to have far less pollution. There'll be much more employment. There'll be much more wealth, like there always is in major infrastructure transformations in history. So we have to tell that story, but we also have to say, and you know what? We need to hurry up.
Yeah.
And so that gets back to that motivation, sort of the sprint or the marathon. Renee Lertzman, I want to ask you, there's been lessons learned from public health and how to shift behavior and flip convention on its head. So tell us what public health can teach us about this.
Well, so there's a field or a school of practice in public health called motivational interviewing, and it's completely influenced my way of thinking about climate and environmental engagement and communication. So motivational interviewing, or MI for short, is a practice that clinicians have developed that's really the most evidence-based approach to really shifting hard behavior change that's out there. And if you really look at what it's about, it's quite radical. Motivational interviewing is really about supporting people as a guide. So it flips the whole idea that I'm going to tell you what you should do because it's the right thing to do, because if you don't, you're going to die, or you're going to get really sick, or all these bad things are going to happen to you. It's about taking the knowledge that we may have, those of us who actually know quite a bit about the issues, and sitting on it long enough to really allow others to reflect on what their relationship is with the issue. So MI, in its essence, is being what it means to be a guide, as opposed to being a cheerleader or an educator or a writer, R-I-G-H-T. It's really about inviting people to say, well, what is it that, what matters to you, and what do you feel that you can actually meaningfully do? So it's a way of engaging people in a conversation with the focus being on change. So
you don't tell people they're pigs if they drive an SUV, for example, or shame people for eating meat, or you really ought to be vegan, or you ought to...
Yes, it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to not come from our sense of urgency and what we know, and just kind of blast that on people. It's one of the hardest things, I think, when you know what the stakes are. But if we want to really focus on what's effective and what clinicians have found over many years of working with people, then we need to be interacting and communicating with people in a very different way that is really compassionate, but it's fierce. It's like there's a fierce, compassionate approach, which is, look, we can't continue the way we have been, right? I mean, that's the real reality.
And do you think so much of communication these days is over social media? Do you think that kind of empathy can happen on social media? Where villainization and attacking is rewarded. You get a big audience. Climate One would have a bigger audience if I villainized and attacked people, because they would be like, yeah.
You should try it.
I think that without a doubt, it can be done very, very effectively on social media and across all kinds of platforms, but it takes a level of skill. And the skill is that you need to be able to know how to raise provocative questions and prompts that allow people to reflect and respond in ideally a honest and human way. So my Twitter life, there's a lot of climate folks on there. And I noticed that when people share, they tweet something that's actually really human, like there's a number of women in particular who are very brave and very courageous in tweeting about their lived experience of wrestling with these issues. What I notice is that there's huge response. It blows up. So I think that people are actually really hungry for that kind of communication and interaction on Twitter, but it's such a it's such a fine line where it can just easily degenerate and devolve very quickly into just, like you said, just a real polarizing kind of base.
So we'll channel Brene Brown when we're
Right.
trying to tweet. Yeah.
Exactly.
So we've been doing work on social media to reach moderate conservatives because we have to have more conservatives involved in this in order to solve it. And what we find is that everything that reaches them on social media is confusing and distorted. And when we put into their social media feeds people that share their values, that come from their tribe, and speak to them about how climate change is going to affect the things that conservatives care about, their family, their health, their property, their children, the economy, immigration, et cetera, they really do respond. And I've sat through focus groups where conservative women in North Carolina have, the moderator would say, well, the earth has warmed, each decade's warmer than it was before. And she'll say, well, how come I've never heard that before? Can you please show me a graph or a chart indicating that? Because I'd really like to know. So, again, this is a combination of a very bad group, a very small bad group of people who are trying to perpetuate their profits at the expense of the existence of human civilization. That's a pretty dramatic moral story. They do all this purposeful disinformation, but it's not just that. I'm afraid our community doesn't focus enough on reaching the public.
We're talking about the Climate Deadline 2030 at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. Our guests are Chris Field, director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University, Renee Lertzman, a climate engagement strategist, speaker, and psychologist, and David Fenton, founder of Fenton Communications. We're going to go to our lightning round and invite you to respond to the association. I'm going to mention a phrase, and you can answer with just one word or one phrase, whatever comes to the top of your mind, unfiltered, and some from your reptilian brain or whatever that part of your brain is that is most honest. Chris Field, what comes to mind when I say carbon capture and sequestration?
Yes. Yes to all of the options for solving the climate crisis.
Renee Lertzman, what comes to mind when I say David Wallace Wells, author of The Uninhabitable Earth?
Glad I didn't get that one.
Oh, thank you. Oh, gosh.
Don't think about what you should say. Think about what came to your mind.
Complicated.
David Fenton, Facebook.
Oh, bad. Shame on them.
Okay, this is true or false. Chris Field, every bit of warming matters.
True, no doubt.
David Fenton, true or false, every act to reduce carbon pollution matters.
Yes, because it gives people the sense that together they can make a difference.
True or false, Renee Lertzman, every act really doesn't matter. We just want to believe that.
Oh, false.
David Fenton, true or false, you have considered getting arrested at a climate protest.
Yes.
Renee Lertzman, one day you probably will engage in civil disobedience as part of a climate protest.
Yes, true.
Chris Field, Stanford's divestment from coal companies was an empty gesture because coal is a crappy investment and many coal companies have gone bankrupt.
Yes.
Also for Chris Field,
it was an okay gesture, but it was empty eventually.
also for Chris Field, true or false, Stanford should divest from all fossil fuels.
I disagree with that. I'd be happy to go on at length.
An ad campaign once featured political opponents such as Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on a couch saying they agree that climate needs to be addressed. David Fenton, true or false, that campaign was effective at framing climate action as bipartisan and centrist.
Clearly, the historical record shows it was not.
True or false, David Fenton, you would like to get on a couch with Newt Gingrich.
True.
Cocktails, probably, yes. True or false, Renee Lertzman, everyone working on climate will be served by being on a couch in the office of a skilled therapist.
True.
Also for Renee, asking scientists to act as communicators doesn't make any sense.
True and false.
Last one. Okay, also for Renee, the white men on this panel with you are good listeners.
True.
Last one of us is better at talking. Okay, let's leave it there. That's right. Let's give a round. Let's give them a round of applause for getting through the climate one. Chris Field, we often hear about tipping points, these things out in the future. I think about that as the Wile E. Coyote moment, where Wile E. Coyote gets out over that cliff and it has that oh shit moment, and then looks down, and we have to bleep that out, but and then realizes he's out over the cliff, and then, of course, Wile E. Coyote comes back. Where are the tipping points?
So, one of the things that my colleague Steve Schneider used to explain really eloquently is that we have confidence of a whole bunch of tipping points in the climate system. We have low confidence about where they are. When I think about tipping points, there are really three that concern me the most. And I think about a tipping point as genuinely a point of no return. One concerns sea level rise. We know that based on the underlying geology of Antarctica, we know based on the elevation profile of Greenland that there's some point at which we're committed to large amounts of sea level rise, even if we use carbon capture and storage to bring the CO2 down, even if we could cool the climate back, that we're committed to in excess of 5 meters of sea level rise, which is the level that's really existential for coastal communities, for many small island nations. We have a pretty high level of confidence that we haven't passed that tipping point yet, but we also have a pretty high level of confidence that it's within the next, I think we have an international audience, so 1 to 2 C of future warming or 3 to 4 Fahrenheit of future warming. So that commitment to more than 5 meters of sea level rise, more than 15, 16 feet of sea level rise, really existential for a lot of the world's population. Second really critical tipping point concerns responses in which the Earth system starts releasing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere independent of what we as people do. One mechanism by which that happens is when the Arctic warms so much that melting permafrost is a big source of greenhouse gases. Another is when areas like the Amazon convert from being essentially fire-proof to fire-prone. Under those conditions, even if we bring greenhouse gases down to warming, we might see a continued progression of a world of high emissions because the emissions are coming from nature. That's a tipping point that we're pretty sure we haven't passed yet and is probably within the next 2 to 3 C, 4 to 6 Fahrenheit of warming. And then the third kind of tipping point that worries me, and this is the one that worries me almost the most, is it's really clear from the analysis of global economies that there are many parts of the world that are more impacted by warming than others. It's mostly the poor countries. It's mostly countries that are already in hot climates that are really the most impacted and where future warming just tremendously erodes their potential for future economic growth. What concerns me is if climate change really does drive a separation between the economic winners and the economic losers, we lose whatever chance we have for a society of sufficient social cohesion to tackle this problem in a meaningful way. So at least for me, those are the kinds of issues that really represent points of no return. Let me just say one more thing about the sea level rise, and I should have said it earlier. We don't have a very clear picture of how rapidly this ice sheet collapse might occur. Most of the estimates are that if we are committed to more than 5 meters of sea level rise, it would probably occur over 500 years or more. Maybe that's room for coastal communities to rethink their future. But if you think about the prominence of cities like Venice that have been there for 1,000 years, for key iconic coastal sites around the world, 500 years really isn't a very long time.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter how long it's going to take. It's immoral to do that. It's just immoral to knowingly do that. And that's what's happening now. There are forces in our world that are knowingly doing that to the people in the earth, and we have to stop them.
But it is important to remember that if we were having this conversation in 1520 rather than 2020, it would be hard for us to imagine the world of 500 years in the future.
Well, sure.
I agree with your point about the
Sure.
morality,
But and technologies may well emerge that we don't know about, but we can't bank the future of civilization on that. That's immoral too. We know how to solve this, and again, solving it is really going to be a good thing in so many ways, as you pointed out.
I totally agree with that.
So, we're facing, in my view, the sort of the ultimate moral story of human history, which is, are we really going to let a very few companies do this to the future of humanity when we don't have to? If you had to do this to have prosperity and growth, sure, okay, that would be a terrible thing. But we know we don't have to do this.
But I think the moral calculus of 500 years in the future isn't necessary in order to take compelling, aggressive action on climate. We're already seeing the impacts, and we're already seeing the unfairness implied by them.
But David Fenton, what you're saying is that there's active denialists, a few companies that are obstructing change, particularly political change in the United States. There's a whole lot of other people that know about it, that aren't doing everything they can, that are not making this a priority in their lives. You note that in polling in the United States, climate doesn't, people acknowledge it's happening, but it's not, they don't feel it's urgent. So there's another area. It's not so simple as that oil companies are blocking change. If we slay those dragons, then
I
change will
respectfully
happen.
disagree, Greg, because the primary reason people don't feel this is urgent and know enough about it and are confused about it is because of the merchants of doubt. It's because of the intentional work that's been done for years very effectively to slow people's awareness about this and to spread confusion about it. I mean, right now, 24% of Americans know that there's scientific consensus on climate change. Now, the good news is that's up 13 points in the last 8 years. It used to be only 12% of the public knew that, but 25% is a very low number to cause political change. Now, the researchers at Yale, here's what they find. Every time they inform any group of citizens, then in fact all the scientists agree, support for action shoots up by many, many, many fold. But we're not informing people of that in any systematic way.
And there was much more consensus, political consensus in the 70s and 80s that it's happening. It was bipartisan. Shell Oil was on board. And then there was that industry, Empire Fights Back, the Global Climate Coalition, et cetera. Merchants of Doubt is probably the most coherent, compelling narrative that I've seen in a decade or more of interviewing people about this. Keep coming back to that narrative. Chris Field, there was a report recently out of Norway that only 5% of government and independent funding recently has gone to the political, psychological, and economic areas of addressing climate change. Most of it has gone toward the physical, the natural sciences. Why doesn't more money go toward our human understanding, the things that Renee and David both learn and practice?
I'm sure that some of the same forces are at play in terms of the distribution of funding as in terms of the creating the misinformation. But it's important to recognize that solving this challenge is going to require a combination of improved technologies, massive deployment at scale, and getting people to understand the importance of working together on it. Which do we need more research on? And I'm sure we need more research on the human dimensions.
As well as practice.
What we really need is more investments across the full spectrum of activities, from the research to the understanding the societal context, to the deployment, to the legislation and policy. And until we see way more investment, it's probably less important that it's 5% versus 10% of the human dimensions. There just needs to be a lot more support.
Maybe Jeff Bezos' $10 billion will help, even though it's... we're going to go to audience questions and invite you to join us. For the minutes we have left, you can briefly identify yourself and pose a brief question or comment, but I'll help here. I'm here to help you keep it brief if you need help. And we'll get a few minutes for the folks there to join us. Let's go to Jan's question. Audience, welcome. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, I'm Jackie Garcia. I'm a member of 350 Contra Costa. This message is for Renee. Do you think that increasing empathy and understanding of the fact that Western lifestyles of the very privileged are creating mass genocide in the future at a distant time is a helpful message, or just too impersonal to motivate people?
That empathy, I want to understand what you're asking.
I wonder if you think it's useful to educate people about the fact that our lifestyles are emitting the most carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that will later raise the temperatures across the globe in places, and disadvantaged people who are in frontline communities are not actually polluting as much as we are.
Oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's vital that we bring that level of empathy. I mean, I guess my message is empathy generally is one of the most powerful, effective, strategic orientations we can have in how we're communicating. Empathy is not the same as letting anyone off the hook. Empathy actually allows us, again, it softens our defensive mechanisms, right? It softens our tendency to resist. And when we feel that there's empathy, when I feel understood, I'm able to listen and engage and learn exponentially higher.
Do you feel guilty about your lifestyle?
Absolutely, of course.
I sure do.
Yeah.
Next question, please.
Hi there. Thanks for all the information today. My name's Noah Friedman. My question is, who is funding the most work for public awareness campaigns about climate change? It seems this is a real critical driver of action or inaction.
Well, there's really hardly any funding for it. It's really sad. If you take the amounts of climate philanthropy and the expenditures by the major NGOs in the field, an infinitesimal, tiny piece of their budgets go to actually informing the public as opposed to speaking to the converted. It's a very deep problem. I think that part of it is because people who don't go to business school think that marketing and communications is kind of dirty and beneath us, and that's that ugly selling manipulative stuff. And people have an inordinate belief that just present the facts and good policy to people in power and the world will change, and it's never been true, and it's certainly less true than ever now. So, many of us are urging that we focus more on this. Most of the funding goes to what I call the supply of policy, studies, meetings, reports, conferences, all of which are very good, and we don't lack a supply of policy. We know pretty much what to do, but we lack demand, and demand is way underinvested in.
Next question. Welcome to Climate One.
Thank you. My name is Jeff Mann. Chris Field, why do you think that Stanford should not divest from all fossil fuels? You sort of hinted at it before.
I think that part of our problem is an overemphasis on the truly reprehensible actions of a few companies in creating misinformation. But I think it also, when I look at how we're going to solve the climate problem, I actually find I find it very hard to envision a set of solutions that doesn't involve the competences that the more forward-looking oil and gas companies bring to the table. things like being able to manage international projects across many countries at billions of dollars of scale, being able to drill precise holes underground and bust up rocks and shoot things into them. And I think there are lots of investments that should be spurned for ethical grounds, and many fossil fuel companies should be. But I also think that we're not going to solve this problem without bringing fossil fuel competences into the mix. And so I think that to be impactful, divestment efforts should be targeted toward particular companies, and they shouldn't be blanketed. I also think it's important to recognize that demand for fossil fuels comes from all of us, everybody who turns on a light switch or takes a jet flight or drives a gasoline-powered car, and it's deceptively easy to say, oh, if it just wasn't for those companies, we wouldn't have this problem, when we really need to recognize that emissions are coming from billions of decisions that are made around the world every day.
Sure, and that's true. And I've often thought we should thank the fossil fuel companies. Great job, look at all this prosperity, and now we know it's time to change. Damn them with praise. But at the same time, I'm hesitant to blame individuals. Individuals are not responsible for the state of our infrastructure. Those are forces beyond what most individuals can affect, except through political action. A lot of people don't want to heat their homes with fossil fuels, but it's not so easy for them to switch, without loan capital, without expertise that nobody's really providing. So I think, of course, like everything else, it's a balanced picture. We all do contribute, but ultimately, this is a system problem. It's not an individual problem.
Just one quick note is a lot of the heating that's happened has been through a lot of emissions of natural gas. There's a sweeping change happening in getting natural gas. There's now electric heat pump water heaters, convection stoves. So the rate at which sort of like the change mentality around natural gas in the homes to heat food and water, new technologies coming forward, and that's a place where we can electrify. That's a place that I see as real traction that addresses a
kudos to Berkeley that's really mandated it for new construction.
And I think it's in 20 states now, people can buy 100% clean energy at retail for your home through your utility, and it costs pennies more in most cases. If you insulate your house, your bills go down forever, but it's not so easy for everybody to get the money to do that. So this is a government failure. The Green New Deal would accomplish all of this. It would mean there would be funding to insulate your home, to put solar panels on your roof, to buy an electric car, to put in a charging station, to get an electric heat pump for your heat and hot water. And we can do all that and pay it all back many times over, but this isn't something individuals can do without demanding collective action.
Next question, welcome.
Hi, my name is Annie Leonard. I'm with Greenpeace. Two things. First, for the speakers who are considering civil disobedience for science, for climate, as well as anyone in the audience, I'm glad to help you arrange that. Please come and talk to me afterwards. Second thing is I have a question about this 30%. On one level, having 30% of the people alarmed about climate is embarrassingly small, given how clear the science is. But on another level, that's a lot of people. That's more than Martin Luther King had when he had his I Have a Dream speech. That's more than the suffragettes had and the abolitionists have. 30% of the public, we should be able to drive big change. So what advice would you give to an activist about the relative importance of growing that 30% to be 60% alarmed, or mobilizing that 30% to go from being alone and distraught to together and active?
I can jump in.
Sure, Renee Lertzman.
Excellent question, thank you. So a few things. One is I think we need to be unleashing conversation. So wherever possible, we need to be promoting, supporting, and facilitating people who are in any way convening, whether it's teachers or in churches or whatever, to have open, honest, real conversations where there's psychological safety so we can get real and then move quickly into strategizing, activating, and so forth. Until we do that, people are in that paralysis, ambivalent, anxious state. So I can't say enough about what happens when people get together, especially in small groups, and can actually talk to each other. And we see that as a profound driver of activism and change. And adding on to that, I would say my advice to activists is to skill up around how we manage our own sense of urgency and our own sense of fear and panic, and to become able to channel that in ways that are effective, but to invest more in really trying to understand and practice the compassion and the empathy for why people are concerned and yet doing nothing. Because that's really the silent majority. It's this ambivalent majority of people who feel completely stuck in a double bind. And millions of people feel stuck. And I think we have the opportunity to actually help us kind of unstick by promoting the conversations and also openly acknowledging, like, yeah, you might feel really stuck, or you might feel really frustrated. You might not see yourself as an activist. I didn't see myself as an activist, but guess what? This is what's happening, and this is why I'm acting. Anything that allows us to really connect at that human level.
So many activists are so alarmed that they're off-putting and they alienate people, and I don't think they even realize it. Their urgency is not something that draws people in. It repulses people. Last question. Welcome.
Hi, Greg. It's Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the environment correspondent with The Nation and the executive director of Covering Climate Now, which is 400 news organizations around the world, including Climate One, we're happy to say. We have a combined audience among our 400 news organizations approaching 2 billion people. And we are doing a special week of coverage for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day around climate solutions. And then later this year, we are doing a special week of coverage around the 2020 campaign. Annie Leonard just asked you a question about what advice you would give to activists. I'm curious to hear what advice you would give to my fellow journalists, these colleagues of mine in these 400 news outlets like CBS News, like Reuters, like the biggest newspapers in Europe and across all the NPR stations here in the US, the big ones. We know that we have to cover the story of the 2020 election, and some people would say that this election will decide the climate future. Certainly if the current administration were to stay in power. So I'd like to ask all three of your guests, what is the story that the press should be trying to tell over the next 11 months, and how should we tell it?
David Fenton, start.
Well, I think that the print press has largely done a very good job of this. The problem's television, Mark, as you know, and I know you're working on that. Until recently, the ABC, NBC, CBS morning and evening news programs barely mention the word climate change and don't cover the story. And while they have a smaller audience, and they used to, their combined audience is, I think, about 35 million people, and it's missing on television. It's on cable, but that's a very small audience, and half the cable audience is watching Fox, which is purposely disinforming people. So I think really the challenge is to get it on television, which is the most powerful medium that we have, and of course those videos get played on the internet, et cetera. But by and large, I think the print press is doing a superb job.
Chris Field.
Yeah, I agree with David that this is the defining challenge of our era. It needs to be covered more, and there needs to be a real commitment to showing the connections between climate change and other issues, and there needs to be, I especially admire your commitment to focusing on climate solutions.
Renee Lertzman.
So I would say an emotionally intelligent approach, reporting journalism that brings in the human dimension as much as possible, that shares nuance through personal story, through allowing people to share their complicated stories. The one thing I would say is that's incredibly powerful is the unexpected. So there's a lot of sort of numbness around the climate narrative and the climate news and the solutions and all of that. Anything that breaks through the kind of the numbness that's unexpected, surprising, shocking, and to me that story is people who have gone from, it came up earlier in our conversation, people who, conservative Republicans who are now really, acting on this. Pastors, farmers in Iowa, young, kids in the hood who are now activated, like really bust open the story so that the faces and the stories are so diverse and so surprising and so energizing that people really feel it at that visceral level.
Not just a bearded white man in the woods who cares about climate, right? All right, we're out of time. I'd like to invite you to join us in reception afterwards in the lounge to talk about climate with a friend. I'd like to thank the Climate One crew. I do this all the time, but this time, I guess I don't know. I want the Climate One crew. I get to sit up here in the bright lights and talk to these fascinating people. They're the ones that make it happen. You don't get to see their faces or their names. So I'm going to invite them to come up here and take a bow. Come on. All of you. Now, let's go. Even Brian off the cameras. Look, these guys are awesome. These are the people that make it happen. I'm embarrassing them. This is awkward. Mark's still staying back at the curve. They do a lot of dedication. It's a pleasure to work every day. Red faces, look at that. They weren't expecting that. I've never done that before. I may not do it again. All right, thanks you all.
The human dimensions of climate change.
Yes.
Join us out there in the lounge for a reception with a glass of wine. We've been talking about what the looming climate deadline means and how to talk about it. Scientists say global carbon emissions need to be cut in half by 2030 to be on track to avoid catastrophic consequences. That causes some people to panic and others to tune out. What's your response? How often do you talk about climate with family and friends? Hopefully more in starting the conversation. I'm Greg Dalton, and I talk about climate for a living. My guests today were Chris Field, director of the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University, Renee Lertzman, a climate engagement strategist, author, speaker, and psychologist, and David Fenton, founder of Fenton Communications, which runs advocacy campaigns for social change. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does matter, and we appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You can go back.
Okay.
Renee?
Go back. Thanks, guys.